I'm an anthropologist, and I tend to sort of stray from that all the time. And so in the last year or so, I began to really think about whether or not there was something special or particular about the anthropology of energy, or if we were just one field among many fields contributing in our own idiosyncratic way to the social studies of energy, the energy humanities, critiques of extractive capitalism, and understandings of socio-cultural change. And I didn't know the answer. I didn't even suspect the answer. It really could have gone either way. I thought maybe no, maybe there isn't anything special really about anthropology. We're just a piece of this puzzle. Or maybe yes. So I decided to look into it, and for the last year or so, from among all of the wondrous things that are written in energy research, in the humanities and social sciences and beyond, I've only really read anthropology. And I started reading anthropologists, mostly who cared for energy in their work, but I wasn't very picky. So I started with what I knew, and I followed citational changes in every possible direction. And I taught a class, and I read together with students who cared about things like resonance and temperature, what the body is in a crowd, and urban stillness. And now today, I'm going to present my first attempt to make sense of all of this. So I'm very happy for feedback, questions. It's a beginning more than an end. In a weird way, I have this feeling it's gonna mesh really well with what Alexandra and Oksana, what I will say, but in a very different kind of way. So I start with the conclusion. The answer is yes, but not in the way that I suspected, because as it turns out, anthropological work on energy never really seems to be about energy. It's always about something else, something ineffable, something that's hard to get at in any other way. To paraphrase William Mazzarella, who's speaking of mana, perhaps energy is nothing more than the dark matter of the social theoretical imagination, where anthropologists place a shape-shifting signifier because they simply don't know what is going on. There's more to energy than this, but I think it's fair to begin here with relational imprecision, with what Evans Pritchard called in exasperation, an appalling fog of confusion. Beginning with a notion of energy that is rather more like an ether of influence than an object, or perhaps it is an in-betweenness that, though it cannot be grasped, has legible effects. For there is a decided tension between the materiality through which something we might call energy can be known, whether we are speaking of coal or electric grids or yams, and the effects of this material has at the moment it ceases to be an object and becomes something else. With the exception of Alf Hornborg, who I read so much Alf Hornborg in the last year, and I have to say it's really not a pleasure. So he's not here, I didn't write that in my text because I was worried. We're gonna talk about him today with sympathy. So with the exception of Alf Hornborg, who is endlessly trying and will perhaps forever be trying to materialize what everyone else is busy dematerializing, most anthropologists lean into the immateriality of influence that energy becomes. They find themselves beginning, for example, with a wind park, and very soon discover that they are talking about the ways of the wind, the way the wind bends and stunts the corn, the way it gathers the dust and unites it to air, a grit-filled merging of bodies and environments. Or they find themselves talking about the way the wind gathers big men to it, with visions of other abstractions called money, power, and influence, development, promise, and a golden future at one scale, but not at another. These are the anthropologists of energy you likely know best, Howe and Boyer, and I will leave them here for now as lights on the floor pointing toward our common exit from a concern with transforming objects into the very human project of enchanting them. Today, I will talk about the work of a parade of anthropologists that is much shorter than the parade I'd hoped for, pictured here, comprised, in fact, of only three: Nancy Munn, Alf Hornborg, and Alfred Gell. Together with the work of William Mazzarella, whose thought haunts but does not figure in this paper, these form the backbone of the first part of an argument about energy as a quotidian magical force that is in such wide deployment at present that once I tease it apart, you will find that you find it everywhere. The second part of the argument, which is actually the part that interests me more, I will not get to today, and it's grounded in the work of Shiv Viswanathan. And because he is an inspiration, I mention him here as well. You'll have to wait for part 2 of this paper, which will be about thermodynamics, unlike you've ever seen them before. I suspect that these thinkers, who are not those who would have risen to the top of anyone's energy humanities canon, but they are the ones who have changed inexorably and forever my own understanding of my home discipline's wondrous engagement with what changes us, what we traffic in, and what we cannot know or see or measure or test or understand. I would, in a future version of myself, bind all this together through a discussion of 2 cognate terms, transition and metamorphosis, the Latinate a beloved, and the Greek an apparently unapplicable descriptor for the form of change in the current moment. For now, I simply gestured toward metamorphosis with the pictures. Forget energy transition. The grown-up version of this essay will be called The Energy Metamorphosis. But not today. I begin with Nancy Munn, whose book, The Fame of Gawa, from 1992, is something that every anthropologist, when you get to know them, owns, but rarely, if ever, cites. It lurks in our minds. It's hard to do much with. For example, 65 pages of very detailed descriptions of how Gawans create time and space with yams. It's not an especially deployable text, but I will try to get you to the gist of it, with a focus principally on the book's second section called Food Transmission and Spatio-Temporal Transformations, which opens with this relatively long quote in which a Gawan man attempts to clarify to Munn how gardens, eating, trade, and fame all work together. And I've put the quotes, I'm going to read them, but I find it's really nicer for you to be able to see them too. So a lot of the quotes I have I'm just putting up, but I'll read them for you as well. When someone eats a lot of food, he says, it makes his stomach swell. He does nothing but eat and lie down or sleep. And when we give food to someone else, when an overseas visitor eats pig, vegetable food, chews betel, then he will take away its noise, its fame. If we ourselves eat, there is no noise, no fame. It will disappear. Rubbish. If we give to visitors, they praise us. It is fine. If not, there is no fame. Gawa would have no kula shells, no gayao, a man of high standing, no kula fame. Gardens and kula are what make a man gayao. Whoever has gardens, overseas visitors come and eat there all the time. They say, you are gayao. They will come and give you arm shelves and necklaces. Your fame will spread. Your garden pays off. The thing ahead is the food. The kula is behind, dependent on the garden food. You cannot feed the visitors if you have no food. If you were an anthropologist, you'd know precisely what the kula is and how it functions, with high-status kula shells traveling in one direction around the islands of an extended oceanic archipelago, and lower-status arm shells and necklaces going the other way, each moving from man to man very slowly, such that one never knows really when the transfer will happen. Knowing only perhaps that one's trading partner has a kula shell or will soon be gifted one, and that at some point he will give it forward, maybe even to you. The shell itself matters because it has accrued stories and relations as it moves, very slowly, from man to man, partner to partner, generation upon generation, each holding on to it until their own fame has become such that the shell might carry his story on with it round to the next man. It's a tricky business, the kula ring, and I'll say nothing more about it, except that Gawa is one of the islands implicated, and there are about 500 books you can read to gather the details if you are interested. What marks Munn's work as exceptional is that she begins not with the shells, but with the garden, with food, and most especially with yams. Equally, her interest is not so much in the microdynamics of the kula, unlike those 500 other books, but rather first in how one becomes a gayao, a man of standing. How, in other words, is fame made? How is it that one person comes to have more influence than another? How is it that influence is not only created but maintained and caused to increase? What, in other words, is the nature of power? Power in Gawa, as in our own societies at present, is not entirely inherited. One can be the lazy child of big men, the kind of kid given to eating, for example, rather than gifting food. Equally, one can gain fame through the careful management of the garden and its gifts, even if one has inherited few trading partners of status from the previous generation. I might look at Trump or Putin and ask the same sorts of questions. Whence all that power? Really, even with the micro details of biography, it is hard to imagine how exactly it happened. Mun would not be satisfied with biography, however, nor does she stop with becoming Gayao, a man of standing, or what in other parts of the Pacific would be called a big man. For Mun, understanding the uneven distribution of power is mainly a step to a larger project of understanding how time and space are actually created via the exchange of something, a yam, that in our world we would render in terms of calories. That is to say, energy that only counts if you eat it. In Gawa, the energy of the yam only counts if you don't eat it. Instead, you give it away. Giving food away to overseas visitors, writes Mun, for their own consumption is perceived as initiating a spatio-temporal extending process, an expansion beyond the donor person and the immediate moment and Gawa Island, as visitors take away favorable news of Gawan hospitality. In this way, food is converted into fame, an extra bodily component of the self. Really nice yams, in other words, create fame not in being eaten, but being gifted. Their energies travel outward into overseas social worlds via uneven exchange. The eaten yam, in contrast to the gifted yam, causes sleep and lethargy. It is, quote, caught inside the body, epitomizing what is not only consumed, but what cannot be released. Eaten, the yam is the potential for fame wasted. It is rubbish. Indeed, in Gawa, the term for a selfish person is, quote, one who eats. Influence, by contrast, comes from being known as the one who gave away a good yam, who threw a good feast, who is consistently generous with exceptional comestibles. The donor, Mun writes, reconstitutes himself in the mind of the other, thus transforming his own level of control beyond himself. The hope in all of this is that one day fame might increase to the point at which one is given a kula shell, not to keep forever, but to pass along in good time. This is fame, and it all started with your very good yams, which you did not eat. I could write about 10 more solid paragraphs on fame, time, space, and quality yams here, but instead I want to turn for a moment to the work of Alf Hornborg. Hornborg publishes something like 15 articles a year, and each and every one has precisely the same argument, which I notice nobody uses or even seems to know about. It's a pretty good argument, so I can understand from whence his frustration in the form of serial publication stems. I will summarize that argument briefly here, because in many ways Hornborg's findings complement Mun's, and not only because they both figure energy as relational, as, quote, a common quality of efficacy or success, retrospectively interpreted, and not a universal medium of it. Energy, in other words, is not a substance, but a quality, or a quali-sign, to use Peirce's terminology, which is something Mun likes to do too. Hornborg, unlike Mun, is concerned with a fundamental history of anthropological engagement with the energetic practices of social life, and indeed of fame, though he never uses the word. And like Mun, his focus leads away from concerns with physics and fuels towards the potent, if abstract, relationality of energy. This relationality, I hold, has given energy as a topic such conceptual purchase within anthropology precisely because of its history and capacity to theorize abstraction. Energy, this is a quote, writes Hornborg, is ultimately a relational concept, denoting natural forces that are available for human harnessing by means of a technology that is itself relational, in that it is contingent on capital accumulation, representing an asymmetric social transfer of resources. Relationality is a word that is easy to say but hard to consider, or at least it's hard to consider in Indo-European languages with their love of nouns, objects, and object relations. Relationality, nominalized, of course, often becomes a desired salve for the mess of the present, as if we could understand what has gone so wrong by turning away from things and toward relations. It's not a mistaken impulse. Marx most famously does this with commodity fetishism. The commodity is social relations mistaken for a thing. Hornborg says something similar about machines, but crucially adds a term. Hornborg, trained as an anthropologist, has spent most of his professional life in the field of human geography. He is interested not only in the appropriation of labor time, but of land. He gives many examples across his obsessive publication record, but the one that helped me understand this best is also the one that feels closest to his heart. The annual British import of Swedish iron in 1760 represented about 1 million hectares of Swedish forest and almost 14,000 person-year equivalences of Swedish labor. So one sees steel, measures steel, trades in steel, but this steel is not a commodity. The steel is not a commodity, but an asymmetric exchange of embodied labor. It sounds like Marx, except for the part about the forest. A forest expropriated to make it easier to recognize that the human reorganization of nature tends to be a way of physically establishing social inequalities. Or even more strongly put, humans enlist physical materials and energies to organize their inequalities. Machines or technology are not only congealed labor time, but they are congealed resources, and empires are the best way of doing this. So that every machine is a borrowing or theft of a place and its nature, not a free gift at all, but a calling of what is elsewhere into the material form that makes here wealthy. We think only about people and the impoverishment of them and then call it crappy governance or a resource curse. But what it is, in fact, is their own failure to be and have an empire, their own difficult placement at the edges of someone else's empire. Their land, trees, and stones are the wealth of others. My point, is a quote, is that such concerns with the physical design and metabolism of energy technologies, particularly after the Industrial Revolution, needs to be complemented with accounts of the requisite global context that made them possible. To defetishize our everyday artifacts, we must recognize how they embody the agonies of ecosystems beyond our field of vision. The ellipse here, the little star, is the word people. Marx has already told us, and we have long since drunk the Kool-Aid on this, right? The exploitation of people. The non-novelty of the agonies of people elsewhere, I think, dulls a little the ferocity of Hornborg's larger point, which is that it's not just people we are talking about, it's the agony of ecosystems. Here is the step that Hornborg doesn't take, which is to ask, what is empire? And here is the answer that we can draw from our understanding from the fame of Gawa. Empires might accrue materials and lands and labors and ecosystems of others into their own shops, but they accrue them through glory, an imperial energy that is the cognate of Mun's fame. Hornborg is so angry that we talk about the Industrial Revolution as if it were the product of British ingenuity, when in fact its machines were made of Swedish forests, American plantation land, African enslaved bodies, and cotton from everywhere but Britain. The coal may have come from their own holes, but their glory, their fame was stolen, and that theft was hidden in the material body of the machine. And then we come along and say, hey, let's look at the energy, and we focus on coal, and miss his point entirely. Energy is not what makes a machine run, it's the organization of inequalities that make it exist. We can see then fame in two registers. In the first, it accrues via overseas commerce to he who gives the materials that nourish both bodies and reputations. In the second, it adheres to overseas commerce in he who takes these materials and their gardens and uses these to increase his own glory. In the first, humans enlist physical materials and energies to organize their equalities. This is not a quote from Mun, but an extracted sentiment. And in the second, humans enlist physical materials and energies to organize their inequalities. Read side by side, they show us that it is not trade, commerce, or even globalization that causes agony to ecosystems. It is a misplaced understanding of to whom fame properly belongs, such that the relations within materials, but also produced via their transactions, do not necessarily only create exploitation or inequalities, but also create relationships of equivalence, balanced not in this moment, but across space and time. Hornborg sees these relations as both exploitative and forgotten. Mun sees them as artful and remembered. Fame adheres to both. It's all in the approach, and the Gawans get it too, in their own way. Quote, if people are hungry all the time and so want to eat a great deal, they will eat too much and deplete the garden quickly. The garden becomes hungry, as it were, when people hungrily eat too much. Sounds like a theory of capitalism. Perhaps my closing text will help. Oh, no, wait. To close then, I turn to this very short essay by Alfred Gell, published in 1988. It's only 5 pages long, and straightforwardly entitled Technology and Magic. In title and in fact, it brings our terms and our concerns together. Gell begins with a very weird yet appealing definition of technology as the pursuit of difficult-to-obtain objectives by roundabout means. And then he binds magic to it, such that we can easily see the magic woven around and through technological solutions, as these are proposed today as salves to our ills. These ills are also, of course, caused by technological solutions to previous ills. For Gell, however, neither technology nor our ills are characteristic of contemporary societies, nor of previous ones. Rather, technology and magic are what humans do, and we do them together. That is to say, both at once and also socially. In other words, we introduce complexity and then we weave enchantments around it in hope of something interesting might arise. Innovation in technology does not usually arise as a result of the application of systematic thought to the task of supplying some obvious technical need, since there is no reason for members of any society to feel need in addition to the ones they already know how to fulfill. Technology, however, does change, and with changes in technology, new needs come into existence. The source of the need is the mutability and the tendency toward ever-increasing elaboration in technology. I think this must be attributed not to material necessity, but to the cognitive role of magical ideas in providing the orienting framework within which technological activity takes place. Technical innovations occur not as the result of attempts to satisfy wants, but in the course of attempts to realize technological feats, heretofore considered magical. Technology, in other words, is doing stuff the hard way because it's more interesting than doing it the easy way around. For example, we could stop using fossil fuels. Not easy, but at least relatively straightforward to conceptualize. Or we could keep using them and develop a way to engineer the entire atmosphere in order to not destroy our own capacity to do other stuff, like get food, shelter, clothing, etc. This is technology, opting for the ridiculously complicated and likely to fail way of accomplishing something that could be more easily and more likely successfully done in a more straightforward way. Of this definition, Gell says, and I kind of love this, I want to put this in everything I write, this is relatively uncontroversial and no more needs to be said about it. Of magic, relatively little also needs to be said. For Gell, it is, quote, a spell or a prayer that does little more than to identify the activity which is being engaged in and defines a criteria for success in it. Adjunct to technological procedures, magic thought formalizes and codifies the structural features of technological activity. Magic, in other words, is a poetics of efficacy, and it is everywhere. 19th century British patents are perfectly this, as is the poetry of alchemy, the Trobriand gardens, which we will come back to again, and even the way Trump talks. It feels like this, the magical invocation of a perfect greatness. You all know it well because it's precisely this poetics that characterizes the energy transition today. I'm not going to read you a long quote, but I'll tell you that I would have read it. This is a spell, and it's of the sort you really know. It's a spell called Net Zero, What Life Will Be Like in 2050 from RBC Wealth Management. I wanted you to feel bored as I read it. I wanted you to feel like, yeah, we've heard all this already. That exhaustion with the precision of the fantasy means that even though this is a discussion of something we call magic, it is intimate to you. You are involved in the battle of the spells. Whose litany will win? Whose technological vision will it empower? This thing, I have to say, from RBC Wealth Management, I mean, we've seen it all before, but it's this beautifully detailed, it goes on and on and on and on and on. This is like the tiniest little piece of it. Here's where it gets interesting. This is not just a recipe for the world in 2050. It's not just words repeated repeatedly to inspire the mind, to take the most roundabout way toward accomplishing a task. It is magical because these sorts of spells have another feature in common, and this is the take-home message of the whole talk. They have zero opportunity costs. They exist, that is to say, outside the world. The defining feature of magic as an ideal technology is that it is costless in terms of the kinds of drudgery, hazards, and investments which actual technological activity inevitably requires. Production by magic is production minus the disadvantageous side effects such as struggle, effort, etc. And indeed, this is what we see in the techno-optimistic recitations like the one from RBC above. There is no downside, no ruination, no drudgery. The future will magically appear. You can almost see it, those 2050 roofs colored in solar panels or vegetation, providing a natural form of insulation and reducing energy consumption. That's a quote from the magic spell. So much so that Gel's example, which has to do with Trobriand garden magic, a seemingly distant form of incantation, distant in both time and space, ends upon nearly the same note. So he's talking about the way in which the Polynesian, so this would happen in Gawa, a magician would give a garden spell. So the spell is essentially a prolonged series of descriptions of an ideal garden, the garden to end all gardens, in which everything occurs exactly as it should in the best of all possible worlds. The pests who inhabit the soil will rise up and of their own accord commit mass suicide in the sea. Yam roots will strike down into the soil with the swiftness of a green parrot in flight, and the foliage will dance and weave like a dolphin playing in the surf. Look up at the foliage, the solar panels. Look up, you can see the future as it comes to pass with all the grace and ease of a dolphin at play in the turning surf. But this is not a fantasy garden or a fantasy 2050 rooftop. If one considers the litanies of the garden magician or realizes that the garden being celebrated with so much fine language is not a garden situated in some never land. It is the garden which is actually present, which is mentioned and itemized in very minute and concrete detail. It is apparent that the real garden and its real productivity are what motivates the imaginary construction of the magical garden. It is because the non-magical technology is effective up and to a point that the idealized version of technology, which is embodied in magical discourse, is imaginatively compelling. It is a technology that sustains magic, even as magic inspires fresh technological efforts. First, the forever flow of intensely detailed scenarios of ideal costless production to be attained technically is not a plan. It doesn't even look like a plan, but it is approached as such and produced as such. It exists in the framework plan. It is rather an invocation and an incantation, a recital that accompanies and guides technological developments. It is a precision accounting of an impossible version of this exact world. It doubles this world, inspires it. It is a transfer of energies between domains and technology as, quote, the pursuit of the difficult to obtain objectives by roundabout means does not exist without this magic. Far from saying that there are no opportunity costs in this sort of fantastical invocation of future technologies, we must say instead that the lack of opportunity costs is what makes them magical. It is the completely legible symptom of their existence in the realm of magic rather than that of necessity. Precisely this is what helps us to identify them as human ways of getting things done, wishfully. May all the bugs who inhabit your soil rise up and of their own accord commit mass suicide in the sea. It is a wishful poetic, and it also charts the course for insecticides. Second, magic when understood in this way accompanies energy technologies most consistently. I hesitate to say always because a survey of the field is too large for me to ever hope to accomplish, but there is something about the immateriality of energy, the relationality of it, the mutability of it, and the power in it that begs for magical treatment. Energy writ large as something that moves between people together with influence, which concentrates faraway places and labors into everyday banalities of energy-intensive lifestyles, and which animates the mechanical, is not reducible to fuels, to thermodynamics, or to theories of mechanical work. Those instead are manifestations of a larger and more powerful conceptualization, if less easy to nail down. the practice of enchanting the world. Thank you. Sorry it's a little long.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nevertheless, we still have some time for discussions. Yeah. Do you have hunger to ask some questions or make comments? Yeah, I see that you have. Please.
Thank you, Gretchen. It's always a pleasure to hear you thinking. Tell me why Hieronymus Bosch. I am drawn also to this art, but I'd like to hear what it's doing for you in this talk.
Does that work? So underneath this talk is a deep concern with metamorphosis. And there was no way I could get to it because I was just trying to understand how these various ideas fit together. And so this was kind of my way of like making you aware of that subtext. And also I went through and I picked the pictures, the pieces of it out. And then when I was putting the talk together, I realized that I actually had a picture for each section of the talk, really by accident, that really fit to each section. So it's sort of it's a shadow of a future thought. And it's the Garden of Earthly Delights.
Thanks. It also looks great, just as a... So first off, thanks for this. I don't really know these texts very well at all, so it was really fascinating to try to learn about them and think about them, or think about how you think about them. I don't know what they actually are like, so that's fine.
You can trust me, it's fine.
Yeah, I totally trust you. I definitely do. So I want you to help me with one thing. Just so I know where you're going with this. You started by saying that you're going to give us 3 instances of anthropologies of energy. And I wasn't sure if you were giving us 3 discrete ways of looking at energy, or if you were using these 3 moments to build towards a question of the constituent capacity for transition or metamorphosis. So let me explain what I mean. So the kind of key object in Mun would be food, which I don't see as energy in the same way as coal, second moment, and certainly I don't see technology as energy. Like I don't see them as similes, or I don't see them as equivalent. They might be similes. So I was a bit puzzled by, or I would want to have a discussion with you about how they're the same thing. I'm nervous about easy equivalencies between food and coal, let's just say that. But if I take it as steps in an argument towards gel, then it's a lot more, it's really fascinating to me. So I guess the question really is, which of those are you doing to help me know how to think about those 3 in relation to one another, recognizing that this is the beginning of something?
I guess that it's certainly not about the object. It's about how it is prestige or importance or fame or glory gathers unevenly to entities and people. So the yam is one way of explaining the way that prestige is created and travels and becomes a part of who you are, not because you eat the yam, but because people talk about how great your yams are. And that talk is what creates this condensation of power that then might actually result in you getting an even more powerful object, which is the Kula shell. Yam doesn't matter, really. What matters is that it's a mode for producing a kind of, I feel this with Trump right now, I feel this a lot with Musk, like there are these people that we talk about, but in talking about them, we're also pointing to their kind of the way that they've accreted prestige to themselves. And so then Hornborg's whole point is that coal is not the energy source here. Like if you're looking at an engine and you're talking about coal, that's the wrong way to do it, because that's how you get into the story of the prestige of the British Empire, right? As opposed to saying what was expropriated in order to make this engine. That's where the energy is. How does that, so it's this question of what is, what moves alongside an object, and how does that motion produce power? It's in a way the same thing that we get with thermodynamics, right? But it's not, it's approached from a completely different sort of history and looking at things in a completely different, nobody's burning anything here, right? And I think what's nice about Gel is that he just gives us a formula for how this works, which is to say, you tell the story about your garden, and it's this perfect garden, and it's the real garden. But nevertheless, it's also the magic is the story that runs alongside it. And I feel like there's this way in which it really opens up what I didn't do here, which I would love to do, but it's way too boring, which is really look at the magical quality of the incantations of like, then we will have hydrogen, and then we will sequester our carbon, and then we'll have great like whirlpools in the sea, and then suddenly the tense turns from the future. It does in this quote too. It turns from the future to the present, as if this had already happened and there was no opportunity cost to it. And I feel like those three together are each, they sort of add up, but they are each an instance of the same kind of concern, which is what is the magic, what is the power, what is the energy that's moving around. And the long section, I mean, I cut 65% of this paper for you guys today, which I wrote 3 days ago, which made me cry. But there's a whole section in there about where William Mazzarella is looking at the way in which electricity becomes a way of talking about these energies too. Like, you know, a kind of confounding of magical capacities. Okay, I should have just said that and like distributed the paper.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we have at least 2, even 3. Okay, 3 questions. Susanna, you will be first, Alexander, and yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. What I kind of especially liked about is how you elaborated on this really twofold nature of energy as a scientific concept on the one hand that can be measured, as was especially obvious in this example by
Hornborg. I love to say his name.
Yeah, okay. So
I don't really love to read his work, but it's really nice to say Hornborg.
This more philosophical side, maybe magical side that escapes quantification, so to speak. Actually, I do not really have a question. It's more like a comment, because I always felt that from the standpoint of anthropology, Leslie White was especially helpful. I mean, White wrote this book on the evolution of culture, and he clearly states, or he says in this book, that, I mean, what drives the evolution of culture is energy, and his definition of energy as a kind of anthropological driving force is energy is matter in motion. And it seems to me that this is a definition that really works well with your concept of kind of developing this whole idea of energy in the vein of metamorphosis. Because metamorphosis is essentially matter in motion, or in transition.
So when people write the history of the anthropology of energy, they always go back and there was White, and White said this, and that's how we begin. And then there was Nader, and Nader said this, and that's how we continue. And now there's 10,000 people, and they're all working on all these different kinds of materials and doing cool stuff. And that's where we are now. And I felt like, when I started this, I mean, I went back to the White, which is a kooky, I just read the article version. It's completely kooks. It's an amazing piece. But I thought that doesn't seem to me to be where the anthropology of energy begins. It seems to me to be where the anthropology of some sort of modern concern with fossil fuels begins.
right? It's like it's a very material argument, and I was interested in what stood behind that somehow, or contextualize that. So instead of taking it as the starting point, it would be maybe, if we think of the parade, 15 people down, where we can then say, so then we have Leslie White, right? And then we have this other history that begins, that we think of as the anthropology of energy, but which is only stands in relief to this other whole set of concerns. Because matter, if we talk about matter and motion, it is matter and motion, but it's like what causes that motion to be potent that interests me. And I think interests the field, actually. It was funny with the students, because the students were completely not interested in any sort of petrocultural anything. They were like, one guy was like, how do we make stillness in urban environments? Great, let's go with that, you know? So that also influenced me in thinking about these things, about the magical and the material, or the energetic and the material together.
Okay, okay. Two short questions and answers. Alexander, you'll be the first.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gretchen. I'm also kind of puzzled and confused, of course, by this. And I have a very formalistic question. You know, in the typical narration of transitions, they always create this imagination that one fuel supply would have been substituted, more or less completely substituted by another. And of course, we know that, for example, in transitioning from coal to oil, it just kept rising, of course. It was not, it was just, an extra surplus thing. So I'm thinking of in your description of enchantment, disenchantment, if this could, be understood parallelly, actually, also as working in this story/history, 19th century history, of course, that, the typical story was that magical thinking, religious fundamentalisms of all sorts and so on were ended by enlightenment and were completely replaced by a rational view of the world, which of course is very much connected to machine civilization, based on science and so on. And you're saying, no, actually it was just an extra put on top of it and concealing, so to say, that there was still this other layer going on. And now, I'm tackling with the relationship. I mean, this thought, of course, is not new for me, but especially with these ideologies, of course, I'm asking myself, okay, on which side are they? They seem to be completely on the side of rationalization, but then increasingly have been used, or all the time, of course, also have been used for irrational arguments or whatever. And now you say Trump, of course, it's kind of an invocation of things that he's doing all the time. And whether I'm asking myself whether this is, so to say, post-ideology, or whether this is how ideologies work, and so on. But I could go on and stop at this point.
I mean, I think I'll try to be brief. I think that in many ways my paper is asking the same questions as yours, what Gel would say, and why I like his example of the garden, right? Like we're back at this we're basically back in Gawa in the garden, is that it's the same as saying hydrogen. That the magic is always there. It's always running in parallel to the technology, whatever is being developed. It didn't go away. It's not, we can call it religious in some cases, we can call it ideological in other cases, but the goal is to somehow see its presence as inflecting and enabling certain kinds of costless developments to happen.
And thank you. I'll make a quick question, but this might actually open, I hope, a discussion for the entire day, because Bosch and Metamorphosis feels like it opens a venue for research that escapes a little bit the obsession for narratives, and that create rooms to introduce the human body in our discussion on energy. And I wonder actually, when you talk about calorie and the way we metabolize energy from Earth and not just the way we inhabit Earth, I wonder if it's possible to write an anthropological history of the evolution of the body related to the evolution of the use of energy. And I wondered really when you mentioned this wealth management projection of what life will be. Really, looking at Bosch, we can really imagine what kind of human bodies are we going to have in another post-petroleum world, or I don't know. Thank you for just opening this kind of brain zones.
I think it's not so much what kinds of bodies will we have, but like what is the opportunity cost-free version of your particular idea about a future technology, right? Like it's about realizing that there is no thing without the fantasy of the thing. That they're parallel to each other, and that the magic pulls the technology into itself. Yeah. So when people say like that technology is bad, why are all of those people thinking like that? They shouldn't be thinking like that. It's because there's another technology and another magical spell that offers up another story. That's where the conflict is, right? It's not that they're stupid plans, right? It's that the technology which they call into being has different kinds of real effects, even if it's sold as being cost-free and not damaging and doing nothing except beauty and glory and saving us all from the apocalypse.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me talk for so long.
Thank you.